Welcome to another episode of Show Me Your RAIDLOG, where we talk with industry leaders about how they use RAIDLOGs and similar tools to help project managers succeed. I'm Kim Essendrup, co-host of the Project Management Happy Hour podcast and one of the founders of RAIDLOG.com. I've used RAIDLOGs for years to save broken projects and to help keep my own projects from getting broken, and I'm really excited to see how other leaders use their RAIDLOGs. With me today to talk about RAIDLOGs is Graeme Sloan. Welcome, Graeme.
Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Can you tell our watchers a little bit about yourself?
I'm numerous years old, and I have spent my life in commercial, really. I did dabble occasionally a little bit in the early part of my life with studying to be a Catholic priest. But I spent most of my life doing commercial work and commercial and procurement, both in the private sector and also in the public sector. And latterly, it has mainly been for the private sector providing services to the public sector.
All right. And so for our viewers who might not be very familiar with a commercial manager, can you tell us a little more about that role and how that interacts maybe with the project leaders?
So the commercial is a sort of halfway house between legal, procurement, and the project leaders. So in many ways, we're part of the governance arm, i.e. we stop people from, in theory, doing a bad deal. We will spend our time looking at RAID logs and judging whether they are adequate and whether the right risks are in those documents. Have we covered off those risks in our arrangements with our suppliers or with our customer? Where does the risk fall? How much risk remains with the company? How much have we managed elsewhere? And we will be the principal negotiators of any deal. So when you're looking at sitting in the room, you would have your project manager, you would have maybe finance, you may have the operations or the designers, but the person that sits as the chair on the negotiation side from our side of the house would be the commercial. They will have the authority, they will be answerable to the board for whether this is a safe deal for the board to sign or not.
All right. So your responsibility is really the financial picture of the project or the deal. Is that correct?
It's broader than that. We look at the project and look at the actual project itself and say, is this feasible? Do we think that the project manager actually has got control of it and he knows what he's doing and he can then deliver it or not? Do we look at we will look at our operations team and say to the operations team, do you think you can manage this one, or do you think that we need more resources, or what do you think we need? So they will spend their time working across the piece just to make sure that everything is managed. So for us, the RAID log is really important because we want to understand what the risks are and the assumptions and the issues and the dependencies. We want to see that whole vision of where people think the risks are. And we will get into that, I think, later in the conversation. But our principal aim as the commercial are to look at not only the financial, but actually the real risks, and are they being managed? Because if the risks are not being managed, they will come back and bite us as financial penalties in due course.
I see. And I can certainly understand how you have a very vested interest in how those risks are identified and managed.
Yeah. And that brings us on, to the main thing of saying that, the risk log is a much wider document than many people think it is, in my experience. There was a company in the UK called Carillion. It was a construction company. It had been formed as an offshoot from a company in the UK called Tarmac in 1999. And it also did services, so cleaning services and other services for buildings that it was building, and associated sort of air conditioning and everything else. So it became a services and building company. And by 2018, it had gone bust. It was the second largest construction company at that stage in the UK. It went bust with £7 billion worth of liabilities. And the reason it went bust was because no one had bothered to work out what were the liabilities and risks we were taking on we were taking on, I wasn't involved in it, but what were the risks they were taking on in their contracts that they weren't passing off to other people and therefore were being left on their balance sheet. And because the liabilities that they were taking on had not been transferred into their RAID logs, they didn't have a good view of what those risks were, and they didn't realize that they had serious problems until it was too late and they went bust.
Well, that really strikes at home that we're not talking just about risks for a particular project, but for an entire enterprise potentially.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is where some people get slightly confused with RAID logs, in the sense that they think of them as a project tool, and I think of it as a management corporate tool, in the sense that I would like to see a RAID log for an organization that showed how all of the contracts and all of the liabilities from the contracts, be it from the contract itself with the client or with the suppliers to that contract, or from other people that you were involved with, were all documented into that RAID log, so that it was aggregated up, so that the organization as a whole knew what the overall picture of risk was, and assumptions and issues and dependencies that the organization had taken on as a whole. So they had a good decision-making capability at the board level of what were the risks that the organization was taking on. And it didn't come as a surprise to them that they'd taken on so much liability.
Do you find that a lot of organizations have that ability to roll up RAID logs to that corporate level?
No, very few. And when they start doing it, they get worried about it and they stop.
Well, perhaps they should be worried.
They sort of go, yeah, no, we don't want to know about that. That's in the too hard bucket. We will put that one to a side, and that is really problematic.
So I'd like to come back to using RAIDLOG and how we use those in a moment here. But before we do that, I would really look forward to your thoughts on the origins of RAIDLOG, because I've written quite a lot about RAIDLOGs. I've done a lot of coaching, but as far as I could tell, the origins of RAIDLOG were lost to the mists of time. But in our conversation a little bit ago, you shared that you had some insights into the actual origins of RAIDLOGs. Can you share that with us?
Well, my knowledge of this is limited. I did try to do a bit of research at the British Library, but unfortunately, they have been hit with a cyber attack, and so people that want to engage with the British Library remotely are not able to at the present moment in time. And I didn't have time to get to London to go through the actual shelves, but we found that in the UK, RAID logs became prevalent back when we started doing large outsource contracts as a result of Margaret Thatcher's time in government, when she sought privatization for services and competitive tendering for services. When large corporates, the IBMs of this world, the Fujitsus, all of the large IT companies, took over services for government and providing those services to government, they found that RAID logs were very useful for trying to establish whose responsibility was whose. And more importantly, as far as they were concerned, it gave them the opportunity to keep banging in change notes as fast as they possibly could. And so they would be saying, oh, that was not our responsibility. That was an assumption. And that assumption, now has come to pass. And therefore, please can we have a change note, because it was, assumed that, but it wasn't necessarily the fact that it was going to happen, and we haven't priced for it. So all of these, our experience in the UK has been that RAID logs have followed very closely large corporate outsourcing contracts that are complex and difficult. And that has been our experience of where it's come from the time of Margaret Thatcher, and gradually becoming more and more prevalent and becoming part of the civil service good practice for large, complex projects, that you have to have a RAID log. And it has been written into what we call in the UK a qualification for training project managers called Prince 2, as a part of the Prince requirements, that if you are running a project, you have to run a RAID log as well.
It's really fascinating because when I learned how to use a RAID log, it was always in the context of using it as a run tool. And I never really had understood or the potential value there of that sort of transition from what was in the contract, what was agreed, to what needs to be delivered, and that sort of bridge between the two. It sounds like that's what the origin is, though. Is that correct?
That's very much the origin, that it enables us to be very clear in what the contract requires of party A, and therefore focuses the parties on when a change note is justified and when there is a reason for approving the additional costs. Now, regrettably, what happens in the public sector is that they have very frequent changes in management of projects and of contracts. And because of that, the suppliers become very good at manipulating their RAID logs and their change notes to generate huge cost increases. And you can see a sort of tenfold, and I've even seen cases of 100-fold increase in the cost over what was projected at the time the contract was signed. And I can remember a certain ex-chief procurement officer of the civil service going along to a very senior civil servant and saying, can you explain to me why your project that was approved at £8 million is now busting a budget of £80 million? And he said, well, we followed the process and we got all the changes approved. And he said, yes, but the actual business case no longer stands up. At £8 million, it stood up. But at 80 million, it does not stand up at all. And you've not considered changing the process of saying that it's no longer value for money. And so those are some of the things that, if you had a good, effective RAID log and you had visibility, you would find that people would pick these things up earlier and it could be more effective.
Very good. Now, before we move on, one more question about this. So the relationship between a RAID log and the contract is, do you find in this context, is the RAID log a vehicle we use to read through the contract and try to pull out the different assumptions and dependencies and put those in the RAID log? Or is a RAID log a separate attachment or an exhibit that's a part of the contract in your experience?
So it can be both. Normally, if you are bidding for a government contract and it's a large government contract, you will have a agreed RAID log between both parties. If, however, it is not agreed before contract signature, then it will be agreed quite quickly thereafter. Personally, I like to have a review of the contract, and I like to introduce what I call a contract toolkit, which basically is an obligations register to start with, whereby every obligation in the contract is assigned either to someone in your organization or someone in the other organization to manage and to report on, so that you can check that all these obligations have been met. But if the organization doesn't use obligations registers, then I would transfer all of those obligations or requirements for things to happen onto my risk register and say, these are the things that have to happen to be compliant with the contract. And if not, you're in breach. And it's a fundamental thing that someone has got to be managing. And the problem that you have with large, complex contracts is that you have a 500-page contract. No one is going to be able to observe every single obligation in that contract on their own and remember every date that needs to happen. So you have to put it into either a RAID log or an obligations register or some sort of register that you can monitor those things on an ongoing basis. And for me, RAID logs have been very useful. Obligations registers are very useful. It depends on what systems the company operates to pick up those ideas.
I'm a believer in that for sure. So can we let's back up the clock a little bit here, and can you tell us a little bit about how you first learned about RAID logs?
I think I first came across RAID logs back in about 2000, thereabout, maybe a bit before. I was working in local government and I had authority to spend quite a large sum of money on a capital works project, and we operated a RAID log on that. And I think that was the first time I used one. Thereafter, I went and worked for NTL, which is an American, well, at the time it was an American-owned telecom company that was a cable provider in the UK. And we used RAID logs on a regular basis there because of either the projects that we were involved in, which were large, or providing cable to a whole city. Is a large project. It has to be managed. You have to look at all of the issues of those. But for example, other projects we did was providing an internet backbone to all the post offices in the UK. It was a large project. We used a RAID log on it. We provided connectivity for every RNLI station in the UK. Again, that was all done with RAID logs and performance criteria, etc., so that we could manage it efficiently.
Very good. Can you share a time when you saw a RAID log save a project, or better yet, kept a project manager from having to save a project?
No, I can't really, but that's because I've been involved with projects with good project managers, and what we've done is we've kept them on track early on, and where we've had problems, we've identified them early on. There is my Scotty moment, and my Scotty moment is for all of those that are Star Trek fans, was the fact that there was a product that we launched. We were the provider of all the IT infrastructure for the BBC in the UK, and we introduced this product called BBC iPlayer, which allows you to watch on demand various content of the BBC, be it radio or be it television. And we had a business plan with the BBC agreed that said this is how much resource and how much take up we thought we were going to use. And the reason I call it my Scotty moment was because I kept walking into the office of the morning and suddenly see this engineer come running up the road to me going, Graeme shall not take it any longer. And you go, so what's the problem? And they say, well, we blew through those numbers last night. And I say, what do you need? And you say, well, I need X, Y, and Z. Okay, right. Then I'd turn to my colleagues who were there and I'd say, right, can you get them that? Can you get them that? Can you get them that? And I then would go in for a conversation with the BBC and say, you promised me you weren't going to blow those numbers. We blew those numbers last night. I've authorized this. Are you going to pay or do I stop it? And they said, no, we'll pay. Keep going. I said, so this number will be good and we won't have to buy. And they said, no, that'll be good. Following day, same conversation.
Well, that sounds like that speaks of success of the project.
Oh, it was a very successful product that no one believed would be that successful, but it was the first streaming service for free in the UK of all the back catalogue of the BBC, which goes back a number of years, and so it was a vastly used and still is used service, and was the basis of many other people's copying that service.
So, as valuable as RAID logs can be, what do you see as the biggest pain point or weakness in the current usage of RAID logs?
I think they are incredibly negative.
Oh,
they
please
set
tell
you
us
up
more about
for
that.
a fight with your customer because you argue over what is a risk and who should take the risk and whose responsibility it is. You have assumptions which you argue about. You have issues that you argue about. You have the whole situation is fraught with creating arguments between you and your customer, which is not something you really want to do. And so the thing I think that, and because the people that tend to sit in the room discussing RAID logs are the project manager, who wants no risks on his project, the finance manager, who definitely doesn't want any risks to the numbers on the project, and the commercial manager, who knows that legally you don't want any risks at all, and you want to try to get them all from the customer and get as many change controls because that will help with profitability. So you all start from a very negative point of view. So that's why I prefer radio logs to RAID logs. With radio logs, you end up with a situation of having opportunities built in. You start off with changing the word from raid, which is a negative word, it has negative connotations, to a more positive word, radio, which has positive connotations. And when you start to look at opportunities, you bring in the product manager, the marketer, the salespeople into the room to discuss what could be negative and get their positive spin on it. And then when you start putting down the positives, suddenly you start to say, well, I can talk to the customer about that. So yes, we've got this risk here, but we see it as a possible opportunity. And then the customer might say, actually, we quite like the idea of that opportunity. Could you work that one up into a possible change? And we could actually fund maybe some of that, because that would actually be quite useful for the project. So you've changed the discussions that you're having with the customer from being always negative of, oh, I'm trying to move all the risk onto you and you're trying to push it back onto me, to a situation where you're looking at how can you actually find an opportunity that the project would be better for the customer. More importantly, when you aggregate all of your RAID logs together as a corporate body, and you start to have a corporate look at the opportunities, suddenly you start to see things, well, maybe we ought to, as a company, invest in those opportunities, because that we can resell to half a dozen customers on the basis of we create that, I don't know, AI solution, we can replicate it with a number of customers. And that can inform what you're going to do operationally and in a more positive light with your customers. And therefore that can be beneficial as well. So for me, RAID logs they're very good at policing what you're trying to do and trying to make sure that you don't make mistakes, but they set up conflicts with your customer. And I don't find conflicts very useful. I've been doing a lot of research recently on relational contractual management and how do you build a better relationship with your customer. And I think that radio logs are a good way to take the benefits of RAID, add a little bit more to it, and have the next generation of where we go with RAID logs into a more positive relationship with your customer.
This is really fascinating, Graeme. So so in the US in particular, RAID logs are not as common, I think, as in the UK. We're trying to fix that. But you need to at least have the baseline of having that RAID log there, which is better than nothing. But I can certainly see once you have a RAID log in place, they can become almost a chessboard. Everybody's trying to push risk on everybody else. And I can see it a very much a place where conflicts can come to bear. But it's really fascinating to flip the script on that and say, well, it's not just about who's going to, you're going to take on this threat, or I'm going to take on this threat. It's where are the opportunities? Where can we find mutual benefits in this process? This is really interesting.
There's been some really good case studies. Harvard have done some, but there have been some really good case studies about how various organizations, I can think of one with Dell and Hewlett Packard, and they were about to break up. They'd had a long relationship, doing a piece of work together. They were about to break up, decided that no, they're not going to do that. They're actually going to work together. No, it was Dell and UPS. That was it, Dell and UPS. They weren't going to break up. They were actually going to work in a different way. And the changed relationship that they adopted has now become standard practice for Dell as to the way that they manage their suppliers, because actually it was much more positive. And what do I mean by positive? From a relationship they thought was going to be broken because they thought that it was costing them too much, etc., they got a 40% benefit.
Wow.
And so the net result was that both parties ended up getting more of what they wanted and doing work in a different way, because they actually listened to each other of what were the pain points of each other and well, I can take that pain point away for you. It cost me nothing to take that pain point away from you. But that was a real value to that party. And likewise on the other side. And that was how they ended up with a 40% benefit overall in the contract value for both parties, because they were able to take away the pain points that they were pricing risk for, therefore reduce the prices and improve their margin and make more profit.
Wow. And I can see how that can really bubble up to the portfolio level. If I can look across my portfolio and I can see, look, I've got five similar unrealized opportunities across these projects. Maybe we should do something to try to take advantage of these and realize them somehow.
Correct.
Wow, excellent. So moving along, I'm really curious to get your thoughts around artificial intelligence and how that may impact or maybe already is impacting project management, particularly around RAID management.
There is lots of research at the moment on AI and its benefits and its others, and it will be more like the Industrial Revolution, but on speed. It will have that sort of fundamental change of the way in which we do work and the way in which work is done. And it is going to be phenomenal. But the risk I see at the present moment in time is with the machine learning and the people that are creating the algorithms for the AI. If they use traditional RAID logs, we will force people into creating very risk averse, negative documents that will create discussions and debate and arguments with your customer. If we can get them to also look at the balancing of the opportunities, then that could change. But if we just ask them to look at traditional RAID logs as we've seen them up to date, with their view of being relatively negative because we're trying to avoid risk, you end up with a situation whereby machine learning will learn that and say, right, so we're avoiding this risk, so that could be a risk. Okay, we'll, and they will turn out a lot of negativity that will cause issues with the customer, and then those debates will cause problems, and then people will become unhappy with them because they won't have that, what are you buying me for? You're buying me for 40 years experience of going, that's not a risk I'm going to worry about. That's a risk I'm going to worry about, but that one I'm not going to worry about. That's unlikely to happen. And even if it happens, we can easily manage it. George will know how to manage that one, no problem at all. That one is a huge unknown risk and could come in and hurt us dramatically. I give you COVID. I can guarantee you no one had COVID on their risk registers. And it fundamentally changed. The telecoms industry has loved COVID. They thought it was the best thing that could ever possibly happen to humanity because suddenly at-home working has become the norm. It became the norm overnight. Large organizations realized they could still survive if they did at-home working. And while the telecom companies have been trying to convince us to try at-home working, nothing. Now, no one phases if they say, oh, well, I'm going to work from home for the day, because actually, they can, and that they'll be online and they'll be talking to you just as much as they were beforehand, as we are now, both talking to each other from home. So that's the thing that I see as a problem with AI. I think it could be very good, but we have to be aware of what we're doing with it and not only take the negative side, can we see some positive side, and that balancing thing that is the human knowledge of what is a real risk that I'm really worried about, as opposed to just it's a risk, but putting it down, because otherwise people will just forget using it and just say, oh, I don't trust it any longer. It's not it creates too much trouble for me. It creates too many things I've got to say no to and sign off on, and whatever system is created by it.
Really like that perspective. It is very important to think about how we develop these algorithms, how AI works, because you're absolutely right. Depending on the data you feed it, how you configure it, it can always be focused on what can go wrong, reduce risk, avoid that, and be completely blind to the idea of there can be reward to taking some risks. There can be upside. And if we're not careful, AI could be taking us in a completely wrong direction by not understanding that.
Yes. I think that it's like anything. When it's new, you don't see some of the risks that can come with it. But when you get to slightly more mature, you can start going, good idea, but what about this? And that's part of the feature of what we should be as senior managers nowadays. It's the ability to say, but we don't want to stop things. We don't want to impede development. I say about commercial, our role in an organization is to say, but when people bring proposals to us, especially salespeople or people like that, we have to look at them and we go, but there is this problem. You can't do it like that because of this. But you can do it like that. So you can do it in this way. You can't do it in that way because that way is illegal. It's going to cost us money. It's going to cause us problems. But here's the solution to what you want to do, but it's legal. It's not going to cost us money. You can get away with it. And so that's the principal role of a commercial, is to find the but, not just to say no. There is no value to the organization if I just say no. That just stops sales. It becomes a sales prevention tool. It's no use or value to the company. I have got to be the person that comes up with the but. You can do it like this if you do that.
I can see that being a very important role for any organization, really.
Yes.
All right. As we wrap up, I'd like to ask you one more question. That is, what is your favorite tip or trick for using a RAID log, or having project managers you work with, how they use their RAID logs?
I think the principal thing is start off with getting everything down. Try and include everything you can, because that way, as senior managers, we can then start to thin out those issues that are the ones that we're going to mark as being important, that we're going to have to take to the customer, that we're going to have those debates with, and the ones that are things I would expect the project manager to manage. Just get on and manage them, George, because holding meetings, the risk is that we don't hold the meetings on time. Well, really, I don't give a monkeys about that. That's down to you. You get that sorted. I'm not going to have a debate with the customer about that. That's what I expect you as the project manager to do. So, yeah, you can have it on the list, and yeah, that's important, but I expect you to manage that one. Debating about whether I am responsible for delivery of this project on time when I've got this assumption that they're going to give me certain information by a certain date so that we can plan for that to get that in time. That's something I'm going to say that's important, because if you don't hit that assumption, I'm excused from this and you can't charge me liquidated damages because I didn't hit my delivery time.
Right.
So those are the things where I'm going to start to say, because of that assumption, if they don't hit that, I'm going to be really up against it, or whoever it is in the project is going to be really up against it. And I'm going to make sure they're safeguarded against that risk. So for me, it's at the start, get everything on the page, then we will review it. My experience, especially from my days with Siemens. So Siemens, as people will know, is a German engineering house, and because they're German, they like process, and process is good. And and I like process, and I like working for a German company, because actually those were the days when you could actually sit down with my equivalent levels. As I was director of contracts, claims, and governance. So my equivalent directors, and we would go through the risk register. The operations director, the design director, and myself would go through these things, and we would go, okay, so what are the risks that we're really worried about? What are the risks and then we would explain to our subordinates what they needed to do. Yes, they had to deal with all the risks that were on the register, but these were the ones that we were really going to highlight as saying, these are the ones that could really affect us and affect profitability. And so that's where I go. So for me, it's a pure case of capturing everything, aggregating, taking it up, looking at it as a whole, and looking at what the overall view is for the company, and what the board can see, and what the board has to make decisions about the risk appetite that we have.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience and your perspective from a commercial manager on RAID logs and project management. Now, if our audience wants to find out more about what you're doing or maybe connect, how can they best do that?
Well, I have a company called Best Contracts by Design, and that's bestcontracts.eu. And I've written a number of blogs on that area. I've written some assisted with writing in academic journals about risks in higher education. So for me, it's an area I spend quite a lot of time doing and enjoying.
Well, I think I would be really happy to have you as my contracts manager, Graham.
Well, it's fun, you know. I spent most of my. I've just finished a 9 month gig of going in and trying to sort out a public sector contract and get a function started because they didn't have a function, yet they were spending billions of public money.
Wow. Well, they're very fortunate to have had your help. We will take all of your links that you provided. We'll have them in our notes below so you can check
Okay.
those out if you're interested. Well, Graham, thank you again so much for taking time to join us today and showing us your RAID log.
Thank you very much. And I trust that your organization goes from strength to strength because it is an important thing that you're doing.
Thank you very
And it's
much.
good software.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
For our audience, if you'd like to step up your project management game, you can check out our new RAIDLOG application at raidlog.com. We're bringing the tried and true RAIDLOG into the 21st century with the only platform totally dedicated to giving project managers and organizations the tools that they need to succeed in project delivery, starting with your RAIDLOG. Come check it out at raidlog.com.